Hello, fellow story lovers and history buffs. It's time for another riveting episode of the Chuchu Blema Sunny African Folk Tales and History Podcast with me, Kabuki Akumi, aka Bookie, the avid storyteller. How's everybody doing? I hope everybody is doing good and you guys enjoyed your Valentines. I saw people getting married, people getting engaged, people just showing off their partners and showing love. Yes, I love to see it. I love love. I love the celebration of love. So it was very nice to see. And then I saw a really funny tweet saying that everybody should wrap it up. Like if you know if you're doing the do, keep wrap it up and don't give us any more Scorpios. But I object. I love Scorpios. Okay. This episode, which is about my grandma was a Scorpio. And I think Scorpios go hard for the people that they love. But when you mess with them, they will sting you. Like that's just the way they roll. I love Scorpios, low key, high key. So I disagree. Give us more Scorpios. The words Chuchu Blema Sane directly translate from Ga, one of the nine official Ghanaian languages, as old time stories. We have about 26 more unofficial languages, and while researching, I saw a website that stated we had over 80 languages. I'm not sure how accurate that is, but I intend to find out. This is our first episode that is history based, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what oral African history means to us. Oral histories are an abundant and multiplexed instrument of storytelling. There is superior detailing of our ancestry and ancestral exploits. Oral historical accounts are important modes of transmitting knowledge that bring unwritten histories to life. We reminisce about the past through idioms and entertaining storytelling. Oral histories are a vessel taken from the present to the past and are a tool of cultural preservation. Griots are traveling poets, musicians, and storytellers who maintain the tradition of oral history from Senegal, Mauritania, Mali, Nigeria, and other western parts of Africa. They use oral traditions dating back over 2,000 years with musical instruments such as kora, which is a 21 stringed looped bridge harp. They use drums or horns to tell us these stories. In Ghana, our elders act as conduits of knowledge by passing down proverbs within our oral tradition, some of which are reflected in our kente cloth print. As history presents itself through the people, culture within West Africa shows itself to be dynamic and continuous. However, throughout history, oral tradition has been dismissed by the Western world. Imperial conquerors have often portrayed Africans as people without history, implying that our culture was static, tribalistic, and primitive. This allowed colonial masters who sponsored imperialists to legitimize their conquest by portraying Africans as simple tribesmen in need of a guiding hand to achieve modernity. Oral history both corrected the records of the colonial era and filled in the institutional gaps resulting from post colonial African governments' inability and unwillingness to continue the bureaucratic record keeping traditions of their predecessors. By the continuous documentation and spreading of our history, we ensure that it never dies out, and the ridiculous rhetoric of the advantages of slavery can be thwarted expediently. We had a vibrant and thriving culture that, if anything, retrogressed because of colonization. We are not better for the invasion of the white man. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. We're delving into the first historic piece of the podcast, and it's going to be a two-part profile on my maternal grandmother, Comfort Asamoah. She was an exceptional woman and a strong influence in my life. I got to live with her for a year in Kumasi, and it was one of the best parts of my childhood. We bonded over fashion, food, spirituality, and music. She was open minded, intelligent, and eager to teach. The day she died, one of the most beautiful parts of my childhood threatened to fade forever. But I've kept her alive in my heart, and prepping this episode really allowed me to connect back with the memories of her through the eyes of the people who knew and loved her best. I found out about moments in her life I didn't know about by virtue of being too young. I respect her so much more than I already did, which I didn't think was possible. Let's get started with part one of her story, Comfort Asamoah, the freedom fighting baddie. Comfort Ya Jimfwa Amonu Asamoah was born on the 10th of November 1934 in Benin, Asante Mampong, to Obapeni Amasewa Kweye of the Asetri royal family of Benin and Openi Yao Asamoah from Riamoase. Amma was a petite, beautiful, and gracious woman who traded cloth, beads, palm wine, and akpetishi. She was funny, industrious, and full of life. She believed in gentle parenting and had a love of children that made it easy for her to relate to them and would usually engage them in long conversations, indulging their every whim. She had an easy way about her, which made all children that came across her feel comfortable around her. Yao Asamoah, her father, was a colonel in the Salvation Army of his town, Riamoase. He was a lively, hard-working man and was well liked by everyone in his community, which he served with the utmost diligence. He was known to look dashing in his uniform, and even though all the ladies flocked around him, he only had eyes for Amasewa. The Salvation Army was founded by William Booth in 1865 in England to accommodate people who didn't want or weren't allowed to attend traditional church. It was introduced to Ghana, then the Gold Coast, in 1922 by Amoakwata, known as King Hudson from Agona Doakwa in the central region. The position of colonel was reserved for territorial and international leaders, and Yao dedicated himself to his job, being appointed as colonel after joining in the late 20s. They lived a pleasant life in Riamwase, a small, close knit community where everyone knew one another. Yao and Amma supported the family together, Amma with her trading and Yao with his salary from work. Amma would often visit her family in Benin with their children. Comfort was the middle child and had two brothers, Bwedu, the oldest, and Abonia, the youngest. When Comfort turned 5, tragedy struck the family and her father passed away after falling ill. His death broke them, and Amma, the young mourning mother of 3, sought the solace of family and returned to Benin to live with her mother, Obapeni Adjoabona, lovingly known as Eno, and her aunts in their family home. Once she was back home, she added farming to her portfolio to distract herself from her sorrow, but it became beneficial to the family as there was always food. It was a large, well to do household where all the siblings and their children lived in one big compound. There were 3 matriarchs in the family: Eno, Nana Quinsia, and Nana Tomoro. Eno's children were Comfort's mother, Amasewa, and Papa Sapong. Nana Quinsia had 2 girls. One passed early on, and the other who survived was called Nana Ya Mansa. And Nana Tomoro's children were Papa Akosa and Papa Se. Nana Tomoro, not having any girls of her own, adopted Comfort's mother as her daughter. Being a dynamic and intelligent child, Comfort was well loved by her maternal family. As the eldest of the girls, she was doted on by her grandmother, aunties, and mother. It was an inside joke amongst them that when she cried, animals in the forest would respond in unison to her. She started her education in Benin, enrolling in primary school. In her preteens, her uncle, J.C. Akosa, fondly known as Papa Akosa, who believed in a good education, often ensuring any child he considered bright got access to one, took over her schooling and she moved to Mampong to live with him and his second wife, Mamin Krabia. He was a wealthy timber merchant and district commissioner in the First Republic, and under their guardianship, she learned culinary skills from her aunt in law and often babysat her cousins. Fondly known as court by the older women in the family, she lived with them until she took her Standard 7 exams and went on to secondary school in 1945 at St. Monica's, Mampong, a prominent secondary school attended by children of high ranking families all over Ghana. She was known as a precocious young woman in her secondary school days and was referred to as an heiress by her schoolmates because her uncle was an influential figure. After completing secondary school at 16, her hand was tragically given in marriage to her uncle's friend, the Mamponghine of the time, a wealthy cocoa farmer who had 3 other wives. She was sent to him with her younger sister, Abnanyako, famously known as La Show. She would often run away from his home, but would be sent back. Knowing what romance was after exchanging numerous letters with pen pals at Adisadel, shame she found herself in a loveless marriage. Her uncle had bought her a sewing machine when she was being sent off for the marriage, as it was customary to do for most women getting married in those days. The purpose was to give them the ability to mend their husbands' and children's clothing. Being entrepreneurial, she honed this craft to her ability by starting a fashion business. Only being able to sew a square neck at the time, she would convince all the ladies this was the end thing by using herself as a living mannequin. It was not a hard sell for her, and she was able to make a little money on the side. Lucky to be liked by her husband's wives, being so young yet wise, they empathized with her, but also admired her and trusted her with their kids. She had two children of her own, Amasewa and Bafo. Unfortunately, they both fell gravely ill and they passed away one after the other. Riddled with grief, she believed that the old women in the palace in Benin were to blame for her children's deaths. She went there with the body of her son, the last one to die, and told them to take him. The old women, seeing her misery, said nothing and left her to cry alone in the compound. The sorrow of losing her two children traumatized her, and after 6 years in a marriage she felt trapped by, she decided she'd had enough. In the dead of night, she fled to Kumasi with nothing but the clothes on her back. Her friend, Elizabeth Nantichi's father, a director at Barclays Bank then, gave her a job as a stenographer and receptionist. She had a new lease on life in Kumasi, and the fight for independence was hot. Fresh from an experience with oppression and a strong fighting spirit, she chose to join the cause. Papa Kosa was a staunch supporter of Kwame Nkrumah and a member of the CPP. His ideals, considered outlandish at the time, slowly politicized her and she became a rabble rouser. She would attend rallies Kwame Nkrumah was speaking at with the other ladies that worked in the bank in their spare time, and they would go out to demonstrate. It was a dangerous position for them to take, as most of the Ashanti was against the CPP, Conventional People's Party, and were a part of the NLM, the National Liberation Movement. People were killed for their political standing, making it a revolutionary stance to take. Papa Akusa's brother was shot down and his house burnt down to the ground. Political tensions were high enough for them to retreat to Mampong. That brings us to the end of the first part of the story of Comfort Asamoah, the freedom fighting baddie. Finding out my grandma was married at 16 made me so sad. It was normal for the time, and I don't think it was arranged to punish her, but her lived experience with that situation, being that young, sent me on a bit of a spiral. Though she was married at 16, she pushed through it all, and I would like to assume that that is what made her feel connected to the fight for freedom. Also, being around her uncle Papa Kusa also really politicized her and made her understand our need to be free from colonial rule. It was also very interesting to see how her mother raised her, how she raised my mother, and how my mother raised me. My great grandmother, Eno, was known to be a fun, loving, chatty woman. And all of her grandchildren, which are my mom and her siblings, spoke about how they could talk to her for hours and how they felt so able to relate to her. And I found that very interesting. When I hear stories about them, it's just crazy how genetics works, because it's like whenever I hear about these women, they sound just so much like me. And I find it very interesting. I met her when I was a kid, but I didn't get to know her. My memories of her are very, very few. I remember going to her funeral in our village, Benin. and meeting her like once or twice. It's just interesting how interconnected our characters are and our behavior is. We have the first ever listener story on the pod today. I am so excited about that. Fusaini and the machine. Fusaini woke up screaming, sweat trickling down his face. He was tired, couldn't get out of bed, but he was able to get up and go to work. He was a bit of a mess, but still had some good moments in his career, and he was able to make the most of his opportunities. He had worked at the factory for over a decade. The rhythmic hum of the machines and the faint scent of oil in the air had become his constant companions. Every morning, he donned his faded overalls, punched in his time card, and went to work on the assembly line, assembling parts with precise movements. The work was tiring, repetitive, but it paid the bills. The next night, he went to sleep and he was up at 4 in the morning. You don't know how much you love to be in this place anymore. The echoing voice he had gotten used to interrupting said. A sullen smile formed on his lips. One day, as he tightened a bolt, Husseini noticed something different. A small crack in one of the machine's parts. It was barely noticeable, but he could feel the weight of it. The factory was understaffed, and the pressure to keep production flowing was high. But Husseini knew, if left unchecked, that crack could lead to a bigger issue. He took a deep breath in and pushed the button to the stop line, much to the surprise of his co-workers. They gave them puzzled looks, but Husseini was already at the machine, carefully inspecting the crack. The supervisor came over, furious at first, but Husseini explained. After a long pause, the supervisor nodded. You did the right thing, he said, a rare look of respect in his eyes. Husseini smiled, a small feeling of pride swelling in his chest. He returned to his work, but this time he knew his actions mattered, no matter how small the change. The hum of the machines no longer sounded just like background noise. It felt like a reminder that even the smallest moments, one could make a difference. The nightmares stopped. Now he had finally accepted his purpose in life. But how long would that last? Husseini and the Machine by the Black Pen. Beautiful storytelling. I read that piece over and over again. It is short but sweet. So shout outs to the Black Pen. If you want to send in your short stories, you can send them in at chuchublemasane@gmail.com. And you can send them anonymously or you can send them with your names attached and I will read it on the pod. Shout outs to the Black Pen again. That was a beautiful story. It's time for another bookie rant. So, I think us Africans are removed from the suffering of the descendants of Africans who were sold into slavery. It might seem like I'm pandering, but give me a moment of your time to explain my thought process and why I feel this way. As Africans, when we say we had no idea how slaves were going to be treated when we sold them, in an effort to explain that we didn't intend to just wickedly sell our brothers and sisters off into the bosom of brutality, I believe we truly didn't. Historically, we treated our slaves better. Slavery in itself was wrong across the board. Like, even if we treated our slaves better, as a whole, it was wrong. We want there to be an understanding that we didn't know about the hardships they would face. As a person who has meant well but was not received well several times, I have come to the understanding it's not my place to define how a person who feels injured by my actions gets to feel about it or how long they get to hold on to that feeling. Not to say one must eternally seek forgiveness or become that person's punching bag. I just have an in depth, empathetic view and knowledge of what it feels like to be on the other side of that dynamic and how explanations can often sound and feel like callous excuses. If ignorance of the law is no defense, then not knowing how slaves were going to be treated doesn't leave us blameless. We're not saying we're blameless. Okay, so then what are we saying? Does not knowing what was going to happen somehow absolve us of what occurred? Then maybe we shouldn't use it as leverage. Must we bang our heads on the walls every day crying for forgiveness? No. The people who aided in these atrocities are long gone, and their descendants, lest they continue to perpetuate colonial ideals, shouldn't have to carry the cross for all time. I get that. I also get how infuriating it must be as a descendant of a person who wasn't considered human, broken in body and spirit in ways that are often too horrific to speak on, will find that rhetoric inconsequential to the matter at hand. I also have a lot of sympathy on how lonely it must feel when both sides of the reason why you are disenfranchised look at you like a nag who should be long over your suffering by now. When the ripple effect couldn't possibly have died out. Just because we treated our slaves better doesn't mean slavery itself wasn't wrong. And using it as some sort of benchmark for why we thought selling our fellow human beings to a land we had no idea about wouldn't have far reaching consequences we would have no control over doesn't sit right with me. I have had to come to the understanding that that's just the way the world works. The powerful trample the weak. It might never change. I don't want to say will because I'm an optimist, but it probably never will. Saying we didn't know is dismissive because, of course, we didn't know. But how much does that matter in the grand scheme of things? It's something to think about. Just think about it, and have a little bit of empathy. We need to be able to look in the mirror and love what we see looking back at us. And if we do, the minute that you look in the mirror and you love what you see looking back at you, not the colonial definition of what you should like looking back at you, you as an African looking at yourself in the mirror as an African, you will find that empathy. This ends the first part of the historical profile on Comfort Asamoah. In the second part that comes out on the 5th of March, we'll detail her political career, how the 1966 coup affected her, and being installed as the Queen Mother of Benin. We'll also talk about the contributions of some of the 10 women MPs who fought for independence for Ghana, who were also friends of hers. Susanna Al Hassan, Victoria Nyakon, Lucy Annin, Mary Cranting, and Sophia Doku. We've come to the end of another episode of the Chuchu Blema Sunny podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. We will be bringing you episodes bi-weekly on Wednesdays. You can catch the podcast on Spotify, YouTube, or Patreon. Like, follow, and subscribe. Thank you. You can also follow us on Instagram and TikTok, TBS Daily underscore AFT, or email us at chuchublemasane@gmail.com. Would love to hear any other versions of the stories you hear on here or just any other thoughts you have. You can also send in your original short stories and they will be featured on the pod. The show is produced by Nikita Kowalski. The stories are collected, researched, written, and read by me, Kabuki Akumi. Show music is by Andre Ayete. And the orators of today's historical piece are Omalara Akumi, Doreen Nako Tetegan, and John Tetegan. Thank you for listening. Until next time, tree blow. Take it easy. This has been the Chuchu Blema Sane podcast, sharing truly African stories.